everyone. Thank you for joining Darian Library on this cold January day. We are so lucky to have Marta McDowell here speaking about her latest book, Emily Dickinson's Gardens. Marta is the author of The World of Laura Ingalls Wilder, All the President's Gardens, a New York Times bestseller, and Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life. While she's not busy gardening or writing, Marta is teaching history and horticulture at the New York Botanical Garden, where she has twice been awarded Instructor of the Year. We'd like to thank the Friends of the Library for making these terrific programs possible. Please type your questions into the chat box and sit back and enjoy. Let's get a little springtime. All right, nice to see you, Marta.
Thanks, Kathleen. So this is my book, Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life, and it talks about the poet's connection to gardens and flowers, and there are many, many of them. Thanks, Darian Library, for having me. So I love to start out with this lovely photograph. This was taken by one of the staff at the Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst. And Emily Dickinson wrote a lot about birds as well. If you happen to be interested in ornithology, as well as horticulture, I can also recommend Emily Dickinson's poems. So this little robin perched very nicely on one of the garden tools. And here's a poem that Emily Dickinson wrote. I shall keep singing. Birds will pass me on their way to yellower climes, each with a robin's expectation, I with my red breast and my rhymes. Late, when I take my place in summer, but I shall bring a fuller tune. Vespers are sweeter than matins, Signor, morning only the seed of noon. So a very hopeful poem. Now, Emily Dickinson is, I think, infamous for being reclusive and for preferring to wear a white dress. Now, it is true, though both of those things are true, but I think it gives us this feeling that she's sort of this ghostly, almost hermit. And she was really very well connected to the world. She read the newspaper. They got the Springfield Republican, which was really one of the top newspapers of the day. The family got the Atlantic Monthly, so she was very well read. They had an extensive library. She exchanged books with friends. And she was really an avid correspondent. So a recent exhibition was called The Networked Recluse, because she was really very involved with her extensive circle of friends. So I just want to try to stretch our minds this morning when we think about Emily Dickinson, the poet and the person. I think another reason why she is kind of enigmatic is this is the only photographic image that we know for sure is Emily Dickinson. It was taken when she was a teenager, and the family in later years said she didn't always wear her hair in this severe style, but it's why if you see Dickinson portrayed, you know, in the movies, or there's a funny show now called Dickinson that's on the Apple station. She's often showed with this tight hairstyle because it's the only one that we have in this case, a daguerreotype of. So Emily Dickinson, when I was in college, actually and in high school as well, probably like many of you, I studied Emily Dickinson. If you had an English class or in college an American literature class, you would have had a few of her poems. They were kind of somber poems. The ones that they tended to do were things like, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me, or safe in their alabaster chambers. That's all about people being buried. And she has some very, very heavy poems, some of her real masterpiece poems. And so for years, I knew about Emily Dickinson, but I didn't really connect. And then one day I was actually working for an insurance company. I did that for 20 years. And I was visiting insurance agencies across the state of Massachusetts. So I was driving and I had an open afternoon on my schedule. And so I just by chance, you probably can picture a highway rest area where those brochure stands, and I stopped on the Mass Pike and picked up this brochure for the Emily Dickinson Homestead. And I actually remember I picked up the payphone and called and said, will you be open if I drive up there? And she said yes. So this was probably early 90s. It sounds like a long time ago now. So I visited the museum and I found out that Emily Dickinson liked something that I liked. I always loved to garden. And I found out that day that so did she. So here's my one special effect of the morning. I had this kind of, I don't know, like over the rainbow Technicolor moment where it sort of changed my life in an interesting way, because Emily Dickinson was what really brought me to garden writing. She's the first literary connection that I made. And from there, I've written about, as Kathleen said, other authors. And that's what interests me, is people who write or paint and then also garden. And what does that mean? So off we go. Let me give you a little bit of her life story, and I'll sort of connect some of the flower and gardening things along the way. So these were her parents, Edward and Emily Norcross Dickinson. So she was named for her mother. He was an attorney, eventually a very successful attorney. She was a mother and a homemaker. They both were interested in gardens. They had 3 children. All 3 children survived to adulthood, which, was not always common in those days. Emily is the one on the left. She had red hair, and so the artist captured that. She is the middle child. So her brother, William Austin, they called him Austin, was a couple of years older. Her sister, Lavinia, or Vinnie, was a couple of years younger. So there are the 3 Dickinson children. Emily Dickinson was born in 1830 in this house. Was a house her grandfather built. At the time, it would have been red brick, and it didn't have all of the features. I'll talk about that a little later. Emily Dickinson died in this house, and she lived in the house all but 15 years. The family finances got complicated, and they ended up, they actually were renting part of the house when Emily Dickinson was born from another owner. And then when she was an adolescent, about this age, they moved about maybe a quarter mile around the corner to a house that her father purchased on North Pleasant Street, a very lovely clapboard house. It's no longer there, unfortunately. It's underneath a gas station, which is a little, like lesson in historic preservation. It was adjacent to West Cemetery. So she would have actually seen a lot of funerals and burials. In one letter, she sort of commented that they were quiet neighbors. And it wasn't far from the school. She went to a school called Amherst Academy. Actually, it was quite close. It was almost catty corner. Amherst Academy, also the building no longer there. But it was, I'd say, middle school, high school. In her early years, she went to some local grammar school, but this is where she spent 7 years studying. It was a coeducational private school. It was considered to be very good academically. She studied things like chemistry and Latin. They would attend lectures at Amherst College, which is just over the hill from where Amherst Academy was. And it's at Amherst Academy that she first studies botany. And she, I think, sort of banks botanical terms because they show up in some of her later poems. And so you get words like calyx and corolla. These are parts of plants. Words like inflorescence when she's referring to the sun. And so again, these botanical terms kind of come in later. Now, as part of her maybe botany class, but also it was a hobby at the time. She made a herbarium. It's a term that's used for a collection of pressed plants. She put them in an album. It was purpose made for this. And it was, again, a hobby at the time. I'm hard pressed to, what to compare it to, remember scrapbooking and when people were doing that. But she once wrote a letter to a friend. Again, she would have been a teenager at the time. And she says, I have been to walk tonight and got some very choice wildflowers. Have you made a herbarium yet? I hope you will. If you have not, most all the girls are making one. So the herbarium is now part of the collection of the Houghton Library at Harvard. It's online if you'd like to flip through it. Again, it's 66 pages. And for me, a plant person, it's super interesting because I can see the kind of wild and domestic plants, mostly flowers, that she was familiar with. We can't guarantee that she grew all of these, but we can certainly say, okay, this is one place that she knew of it. So I'm going to enlarge this little pansy so that you can see it a little better. So this is Viola tricolor. That's the botanical name. It was then and still is. It is what I call Johnny Jump Up. She called it Heart's Ease. It's quite easy to grow from seed, and if it likes your garden, it will sow itself around and pop up at different places, which is why it's called Johnny Jump Up. You can see that she's pressed it, probably in a book. We've never found any evidence of a flower press, and she has glued them down with little strips of paper. So it was a very labor-intensive process. After the botanical name, so the scientific name here, there are little numbers, and that is how flowers were classified at the time. It was by the number of pistils and stamens, and so she was putting in scientific information as well. So super interesting. Now, in addition to this collection, which she seemed to do intermittently through her whole life. So it seems like she kept at it because there are flowers that came from other people well into her adulthood. She also would press flowers for correspondence. So these are hybrid pansies, the bigger ones, not the little Johnny Jump Ups. And she has pressed them and arranged them very nicely, as you can see. They're even tied with a little interesting piece of string. And she has enclosed this in a letter that she sent when she was an adult to someone named Thomas Wentworth Higginson. We're going to talk more about him in a few minutes. She would also leave nosegays for friends at their homes or sometimes in the pews of the Congregational Church where she went, at least as a child. She seemed to like to give people things. And so I brought some of my flowers. Maybe you can see them. So these little Lenten roses, these are not something Emily Dickinson grew. Actually, these are Christmas roses, Helleborus niger. She might have picked them and, made a little bouquet for you. So she communicated with flowers in different ways. It doesn't seem, and I certainly have tried, that she used the language of flowers in that Victorian sense in any but the most general way. So they didn't own any floral dictionaries, and it doesn't seem like she did that. But plants appear in her letters and poems. So her sister was off visiting cousins in Boston, and Emily Dickinson sits down, she writes a letter to her cousins, and she tells them to tell her sister something. And she said, "Tell Vinny I counted 3 peonies' noses just out of the ground." Now, if you happen to have peonies in your garden, if you go out now, you may very well start to see those noses emerging, because while it's chilly, it hasn't been a really frigid January. And we have had some freezing and thawing, and the peonies will start to push. It doesn't matter if it gets cold later on, they have a sort of antifreeze, so they can stand it. But I did love that comparison to peonies' noses. And the letter goes on and says, "They're red as Sammy Matthews." Sammy Matthews was a little boy who worked for them in their stable. So he was like a little farmhand. So you can imagine this little boy, probably Irish, with a red nose. They had a lot of Irish servants. Here is her sister, Lavinia. Vinny shared the garden with Emily. And so that she will talk about Vinny's garden, so I don't know if they divided up the beds, but they definitely gardened together. And one winter day, Emily Dickinson was sitting probably in the parlor and writing a letter. And she tells her correspondent, "Vinny is in Bliss's catalog, prospecting for summer." Now, if you're a gardener, you know exactly what this means. She was going through a seed catalog. This is the cover of the actual issue of the catalog that Vinny was prospecting in. And at the time, there were loads of seeds available for gardens, and in fact, quite a number of plants as well. So don't think that just because they lived in the second half of the 19th century, they had less variety to choose from. In many ways, they had more variety. They had dozens of different varieties of geraniums, for example. Emily Dickinson sometimes would connect herself with specific flowers. One of them was the daylily, this kind of, open, very, very exuberant flower. It doesn't seem to be like the one you would connect with someone who loved to wear white. And here comes Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He wasn't a name that I was familiar with when I started out on this Emily Dickinson campaign of mine. But it turns out that he was at the time very well known. He was an editor and author. He was a staunch abolitionist. He was one of the first editors of the Atlantic Monthly. And he had written an article in the Atlantic Monthly. It was a new publication at the time, but the Dickinsons were subscribers. And it was a letter to, addressed to young authors, young writers, saying, keep at it. I'm very interested in your work. And Emily Dickinson, this very shy poet in Amherst, writes him a letter and encloses some of her poems. And in this letter, she says, "Are you too occupied? Are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive?" Right? Emily Dickinson's letters are like reading, lightning on a page. So you can imagine this fellow in Boston gets this with these unusual poems, and they start a correspondence. It was never a love kind of relationship, but they had this kind of professional relationship where he was her mentor. He didn't encourage her to publish. Again, Dickinson's poems are very different from the standard, if you read Emily Dickinson compared to like Whittier or someone like that, they're very different. But he did encourage her to keep writing. Many years later, the Civil War intervenes. Higginson is married. He's got his own family. He was an officer in the Union Army during the Civil War. And he comes back, he has life, and eventually he has a reason to go to Amherst. He'd always invited Emily Dickinson to come visit him and visit his wife in Boston, and she never would. But he arranges to visit her. And so he goes to their house, and he's waiting in the parlor. And then Emily Dickinson comes in, and he describes her very specifically, wearing a white dress with a blue knit shawl. And he says that she hands him 2 daylilies and whispers, "These are my introduction." And then sort of talks kind of nonstop for an hour straight. He wrote to his wife that night, again, with all this detail, which was wonderful, and said, he'd never been kind of so exhausted by a conversation with anyone. So again, she was very intense. So these are my introduction. And we know that she grew them, she had them in the herbarium as well. She would also occasionally refer to herself as Daisy, kind of as a, almost a pet name, if you will. And daisies also appear in the herbarium. And I love this page. This is the 8th page of the herbarium. It's a very elegant layout. And the bottom, the daisies, those 2 cross daisies always remind me sort of a coat of arms, I think. So in 1854, so Emily Dickinson would have been 24 that year, her father purchases the old family homestead back. So, he's now made it. He's a lawyer. He actually eventually served in the House of Representatives. He was in Massachusetts state government as well. And he does up the house, right? You see people do this. They buy a house and then they remodel. So he had the inside and the outside worked on. On the outside, he put on the cupola, so that, that little square thing on the top of the roof line. He put on that portico in the front and he paints it yellow. He also puts on the porch, which at the time he called a piazza, because it was supposed to be Italianate, right? All these little features that he's adding. And he adds the fence and the hedge. It was an extensive piece of property. So about 3 acres on this side of the street and a 10-acre meadow on the opposite side of the street. Next door, the following year, he builds another house for his son, Austin, who married Susan Gilbert, who was a friend of Emily's and Lavinia's and Austin's. And so they marry and they move next door into a brand new house called the Evergreen. So an Italianate built from scratch. This has a whole like bell tower in the middle. And the Evergreens, Austin and Susan, they gardened, they landscaped in the latest style. And there is a path, and there was a path that connected the 2 houses behind the fence and hedge. So it was like a family compound. Here's a little map to kind of place you. I love old maps. So the circle is around the homestead. And next door is the Evergreens, and we'll get there. Here's the Dickinson Meadow. You can see to the bottom left, there's a factory. So within easy sight of the Dickinson home is the hat factory. They manufactured palm hats. You can also just make out the train tracks. Her father was instrumental in bringing the train to Amherst, which was very important at the time. And then if you look to the top, you can see that cemetery I mentioned. And where it says Mount Pleasant, that would go in on the left-hand side to where their old house was on North Pleasant Street. And there's the evergreens. And again, it's just a brief walk to town. The town center is just off the map there. Her father added to the now kind of old new house a conservatory for growing plants in the winter. It wasn't to be a 4-season greenhouse. This was really for the cold weather months. Emily loved this little glass room. She called it the little garden off the dining room. And it actually, it's on top of a dining room window that you would open to keep it heated in the winter. And there's a doorway that comes through her father's study. Dickinson wrote about some of the plants that they grew there. She loved to force bulbs. Again, I'll hold up. You know, now is a good time of year to be forcing bulbs. These are some paper whites, but she especially liked to force hyacinth bulbs, which are not hard to force either. But her niece later recalled her Aunt Emily forcing hyacinths and then bringing them up to her bedroom windows and having sort of a rainbow of fragrance, if you will. In describing the conservatory, Dickinson once wrote to a friend, "I have but to cross the floor to stand in the spice aisles," right? And if you think about walking into a greenhouse in the winter, it's just that wonderful redolent smell of plants and sort of moist soil. I love that, you know, to stand in the spice aisles. And she grew oxalis and fuchsia and all sorts of things in the winter. And then the plants would go out onto the piazza for the summer. And she's always loved geraniums, so more of those scented geraniums. And then they gardened on the long slope that extends to the east side of the house. It's different today. Unfortunately, there are no pictures or drawings of what the garden looked like back in the day. So we just do the best we can. That big oak tree that you see that sort of overhangs the garden was planted by her brother. So it's, you know, what, 150 years old. So it's quite big and does also throw a lot of shade. On the right-hand side, I noticed some peonies, which are up. I'm not sure if they're the original peonies. Chances are they could be. Also, there are lilacs on the property because they both last really forever unless you dig them up and throw them away. So we like to think so anyway. Here's a short poem. "My garden like the beach denotes there be a sea. That's summer. Such as these, the pearls she fetches, such as me." And so again, her garden poetry is often metaphorical. You know, are these pearls, are they poems? Are they people? Are they flowers? You know, or are they all three? And that's part of the fun of poetry. Of her favorite flowers, I would say probably the rose. It certainly appears more often than any single flower in her poems and letters. And her niece left a list of the various kinds of roses that they grew in the garden. So we've been trying to add those back in, you know, get them from antique rose suppliers and get them going again. We've had great success with the blush noisette. It came from an online supplier and came basically like a stick with a few roots on it. And within a season or two, we had to put up that pyramidal trellis. And it blooms and blooms and is quite fragrant. So if you want to try one old garden rose, try to find the blush noisette. Now, Emily Dickinson was also a baker, and I also like to bake. I actually baked a batch of cookies this morning, and this was one of her recipes. So if you're looking for instructions, you're going to be disappointed. This was for a coconut cake. Um, I worked with a woman, we did a workshop on pressing flowers and making one of the Dickinson cakes. She made this coconut cake, and I will tell you, to hand grate a coconut, a fresh coconut, is a lot of work. But this woman who was the baker of us, she said, some of Dickinson's poems are like recipes. They just have this list of ingredients. And here's one example where she writes, to make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee, one clover and a bee, and reverie. The reverie alone will do if bees are few. Now, of course, she did not live on a prairie, and this, if you're a pollinator person, this isn't actually true, but I think it's still a lovely little poem. Now, she didn't live on a prairie, but she did have a meadow across the street. So this is looking in another direction across the Dickinson Meadow. So you don't see the hat factory, but you do see Amherst College. So again, from Emily Dickinson's bedroom, which was at the front of the house facing Main Street, she would have seen Amherst College every day and seen this meadow. And so one of the neighbors wrote this, the meadow was always full of birds and bees and butterflies, especially when they hadn't just hayed it, because that's what the meadow was really used for, to cut hay for the livestock. The Dickinson homestead had a barn that no longer is there. And, you have to think of it also as fairly farmy. There was also a really extensive vegetable garden. At any rate, it's pretty in all seasons. Dickinson wrote poetry about all of the different seasons, about autumn, about winter. This is a period photograph that's in the Yale University Library of the evergreens. So this would be looking toward the homestead, towards where Emily Dickinson lived, from where her brother lived. And it's a lovely picture and gives you an idea of the landscape at the time. And here's one Dickinson winter poem. Winter is good. His horror delights italic flavor yield to intellects inebriate with summer or the world, generic as a quarry and hardy as a rose, invited with asperity, but welcome when he goes. I always feel that way about winter too. I like it, but I'm happy when it goes. Now, later in life, really toward the end of her life, Emily Dickinson met a new friend whose name was Mabel Loomis Todd. Mabel was married to a professor of astronomy at Amherst College. So they moved to town. He's going to take up a teaching post. And she gets friendly, they both get friendly with the Dickinson family as a whole. Mabel, is very talented. So she writes, she paints, she plays the piano and sings. She was quite pretty. And she would come to the homestead and play the piano. They had a nice piano. Emily played the piano as well. She would sing. She and Emily never met face to face. Emily would not come in the room when Mabel was there. By this time of Emily Dickinson's life in the 1880s, she was now quite reclusive. Really only saw, the family and the household staff. And yet they did correspond, even though they essentially lived across the street from one another, and they exchanged things. So Emily Dickinson would send Mabel flowers. She would send her a poem or a letter. Mabel sent Emily Dickinson this picture of Indian pipes. Indian pipes, there's a photograph of Indian pipes. You may have seen them. They're a strange little saprophyte, so it's a kind of like a fungusy thing. So it doesn't photosynthesize, it's not green, but it exchanges nutrients with the roots that it grows on from other plants. And when Emily Dickinson gets this, she writes to Mabel and says that without suspecting it, you should send me the preferred flower of life, seems almost supernatural. And she talks about finding Indian pipes when she was a child. She writes, I still cherish the clutch with which I bore it from the ground when a wondering child, an unearthly booty, they do look sort of unearthly, and maturity only enhances mystery, never decreases it. And, that almost gives me shivers. Now, Emily Dickinson died in the 1880s. On her death certificate, it says that she died of Bright's disease, which is a kidney disease. No one is really sure. She was buried in West Cemetery, so basically just behind the house. The Irish sort of workers who worked on the property carried her coffin up to West Cemetery to be buried. And after the funeral, her sister Lavinia had been asked by Emily to burn all of her papers. And Lavinia goes back and burns all of the letters Emily Dickinson ever received. So those are all gone. We only know half of her correspondence, the ones she sent. And then Lavinia finds about 40 little booklets, hand-sewn, handwritten, of poems. Now, they all knew Emily Dickinson wrote poems. She shared them with people readily, but they had no idea of the volume of poems. There were something like 500 poems that Emily had carefully copied out and again, sewn together into books. And Vinnie said, I got this Joan of Arc feeling that, she had to get these into print. So she starts taking them around to people and eventually goes to Mabel Loomis Todd of the Indian Pipes. And Mabel, who's again pretty and vivacious and very convincing, goes to Thomas Wentworth Higginson of the Daylilies and convinces him that they should do a volume of Dickinson's poems. And so the first volume comes out 4 years after Dickinson's death. Note the Indian pipes on the cover. Remember, Mabel has edited the poems. She actually transcribed them all from Emily Dickinson's handwriting, which is not great, on a little old-fashioned typewriter. And they're published. They are popular. And so 2 more volumes follow, as well as a couple of volumes of Emily Dickinson's letters, which Mabel also starts to collect from people that knew Dickinson. And so that is how Emily Dickinson became known to the broader public. It was all after her death. Now, should you get up to Amherst, and one of these days we will all, be vaccinated and get out there and go back to museums, there's a lot to see at the Emily Dickinson Museum. It includes both the Homestead and now the newly restored Conservatory, as well as the Evergreens. So the Conservatory was demolished. It was probably kind of falling down in 1917 by the family that bought it from Dickinson's last surviving niece, the last member of that extended family. They took it down. In good New England fashion, they reused the windows in a garage that they built on the property, and they stored the old doors in the rafters of that new garage. So to a great degree, the restored conservatory, is put back together again. And so now you can step through Mr. Dickinson's study and step right into the conservatory, or as she called it, into the spice aisles. And they've put out a lovely selection of plants that Dickinson knew and grew. And they are all potted up in a Connecticut potter's pots. His name is Guy Wolf, and he's very famous for doing these reproduction pots. The bedroom, so again, her bedroom is at the front of the house. It's a very bright room. But when I first went there, and for a couple of decades after that, it was papered in sort of a beige paisley. It was very bland. And it kind of looked like a room that someone who wore white would be sitting in. And they did a reconstruction of the bedroom, took it down to the studs so that they could move the doors back to where they had been when the Dickinsons lived there. And underneath a molding, they found a scrap of the original wallpaper and had it reproduced. And look, it's as if she was writing in a garden. So she may have worn white, but she certainly had color and flowers all around her. There's the side of the house. That's Austin's big white oak tree. And the garden, we do the best we can. I try to go up there every year, sadly not last summer, and help them. And we organize a group of volunteers and divide the plants and plant annuals. And you can see I do not wear white when I am gardening. I don't know if Emily Dickinson did. And I'll just close with this poem. It's about clematis or clematis, depending on who taught you how to say it, and about the seeds of clematis. And it goes like this. "'Tis customary as we part, a trinket to confer. It helps to stimulate the faith when lovers be afar. 'Tis various as the various taste. Clematis journeying far presents me with a single curl of her electric hair." And if you look on the left, that is the seed pod forming, and it is sort of like electric hair. I just think that's marvelous. And so with that, I will again thank the Darian Library. There is the daguerreotype in its case. You often don't see the case, but there is a little leaf embossed in the velvet. That daguerreotype is in the Amherst College rare book collection. So I'll just stop my share there and see what kind of questions you have. You can put them right in the chat if you have any questions you'd like to ask.
From Barbara, did you grow your Christmas roses indoors or are you in a warmer climate? My light just went off. I'm looking for ways to extend the season and garden indoors. My hellebores won't show up until April in my garden.
Okay, so there are two kinds of hellebores. The ones that I started with are probably the kind that you are growing, which is the Lenten rose. There's a different species that's the Christmas rose. So they're both Helleborus, and one of them is Helleborus orientalis, which is the sense oriental, right? That's the April blooming one. This one that is in bloom here, and it's outdoor bloom, is Helleborus niger. And that's called the Christmas rose because if you have a fairly warm early winter, it will bloom at Christmas, which always seems astonishing. In fact, it's in my little front garden, and I always think it looks somewhat fake because there are these white blooms coming up out of the ground. So just try to find a Helleborus niger. This one is the variety is called Joseph Lemper. Ask your nursery if they can get you some, and that should help. Also, I do have some early snowdrops that are in bloom. But you just, again, you have to get different varieties and some of them bloom earlier. I garden in Chatham, New Jersey, which is solidly zone 6. So I'm not sure, I think Darien's zone 6 as well.
There's also a comment from Barbara. It occurs to me that white would have set off her red hair, so not such a colorless woman, perhaps, question mark.
Yes, and You know, if you read her writing, and I would very much suggest, in addition to poems, read some of her letters. She was far from colorless. You know, she had strong opinions, and she had strong expectations that her friends would keep in touch with her in a, you know, in a certain way, and in, you know, regularly. A friend, a mutual friend of she and Vinny had written a joint letter, you know, addressed to both of them. And Emily Dickinson responded, "A mutual plum is not a plum." You know, like, don't be sending me like a joint letter. I want my own letter.
There was another comment earlier from Sharon. I went to Amherst and you couldn't really avoid Emily Dickinson.
That is true. And it's also true if there are any Mount Holyoke grads in the audience, because Emily Dickinson did attend Mount Holyoke for 1 year. So she is one of their famous alums.
I have a question. Do you think the house is open now, or we'd
No.
just have to check? Oh, it's closed. Okay.
No, it's not open. The programs I've been doing with them since the onset of the pandemic have all been virtual. They did their poetry festival was virtual, which includes every year, if you're interested in Dickinson, they do a Emily Dickinson marathon and read all 1,800 plus poems. So this year it was all online, and it was actually wonderful because there were people from all over the world that read poems in a virtual room. Normally it's at the Homestead, and so you have to physically be there and take turns, and you know, you have a book or borrow a book. But this really worked out well. And they have a lot of interesting programming too. So they do a lot of, you know, they do new poetry as well. So when the museum is open, if you are a writer or an artist, you know, a creative person, and want to, it sounds a little funny to say it, but if you want to rent Emily Dickinson's bedroom, you can arrange to sit in the room. They set up a card table and a, you know, a kind of card table type chair, and you can sit in the room for an hour and work, which I've done. It's a marvelous thing, and just have an hour of time to meditate or work.
That sounds delightful.
Yeah.
We also have a thank you from Allie, just saying she received this book as a gift, and thank you for the event.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And I'm sure that the library has a copy that, you know, that will circulate as well. So.
Yep. And one more thank you from Andrea. So I think you've been well received this morning, as has Emily. And thank you for sharing your morning with us. They're always so interesting.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. Thanks, everyone.